Thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. You know, when you add in all types, there are over 5,300 colleges and universities across the country. And advertising in higher ed has skyrocketed to nearly $2 billion today. Most of them are trying to figure out the most effective ways to market to students, whether just out of high school or as adult learners. Dale Leatherwood is the co-founder of ClearDegree and a real expert in helping colleges and universities grow enrollments, but also in helping students navigate through the thousands of choices they have as they get bombarded with marketing messages. On this episode, we'll speak about successful performance marketing techniques in higher education and how these institutions should adapt in order to grow. So let's get an education on diving with sharks from a higher ed master on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Thank you, Dale, for joining us on A Shark's Perspective today. Really excited about having you on the show to talk about performance marketing, especially in the higher ed space. So tell us, if you will, a little bit about your career, your background, and where you got to today.
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me. Great to talk to you again. And I've been one of the very few that have been lucky enough to graduate with a degree in marketing and actually got a job and have been in the space on one level or another for quite a long time now. I'm embarrassed to say how long it's been since I graduated college. But I started right after graduating. I was very lucky to get into the sports marketing space. First job out of college in Chapel Hill, working with UNC Athletics, and from that point have had a few opportunities in the marketing space specifically. But really in the late 90s, I got involved in the training and education space. And at the beginning was involved in distance education. At the time, that was called CBT, or computer-based learning. Marketed information technology, education courses and certification courses delivered on CD-ROM, as well as in-person events. And then a few years later, in the early 2000s, was able to get my first opportunity in higher education. And that's really when I started getting involved both in the lead generation space, the online education space, and the intersection of the two, and saw what a huge industry not only education was, but education marketing was, and got into it at a point when education was really riding high. Unemployment was fairly high. As a result, being counter-cyclical, education was very, very popular at the time, and it exploded. And from then on, it's evolved over time and been seen significant peaks and valleys. But education marketing is still a pretty massive thing, and schools are really today still literally trying to figure it out every single day.
So let's talk specifically then about the changes in higher ed marketing, and
Sure.
kind of go into a little more detail of what's transpired. I know a lot of people obviously very familiar with your brick and mortar nonprofits, and with your for-profits have become a lot more prevalent. But talk about some of the things that have evolved over, what is relatively a short time frame over the last, say, 10 years, and the changes you've seen.
Yeah, so there are really three. I'll kind of group into three phases or epochs, if you would. So up until, I'd say, the early 2000s, late 90s, you had what I would call traditional marketing that was primarily driven by nonprofits, that was very much male-based. And interestingly enough, I have two kids, the oldest which will be starting college in the fall. He went through this as well in the last year or two. So many nonprofits still to this day are sending tremendous amounts of direct mail. You're getting a lot of letters that are form letters, essentially. I collected several dozen of them and posted an article on LinkedIn showing samples of all of the letters from all the schools that basically said the exact same thing, because the exact same companies are sending them out on their behalf. So that was a predominant fashion of education marketing up until, again, the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, you saw a strong influx of for-profit schools coming and spending a tremendous amount of marketing dollars. And that's when online lead generation exploded. So that was the second phase, where you had a lot of different websites that were college search sites that got into the lead generation aspect of the business, where they would have a list of schools, the schools that paid to be there to present their information. Individuals would fill out a form to request information on either a degree program or on specific schools. Those leads would then be provided to the schools for a fee, and the schools would then contact those leads. And there were times when, just for an individual school, I was managing thousands of leads a month, and then when I went into the agency side, managing multiple schools, literally hundreds of thousands of leads on a monthly basis through that format. So fast forward from the early 2000s to around 2010 or so, and you started to see dollars transitioning, particularly as the for-profit space started to crater a little bit through a lot of different things, the government, social issues, et cetera. But as the for-profit dollars started to shrink, you saw at the same time a larger emphasis on social media marketing, essentially Facebook as an equal partner in the marketing space to Google AdWords. And so now schools are spending dollars primarily on their digital presence, their website, Facebook, Google AdWords, spending a much smaller amount of dollars on traditional marketing, direct mail, although some brands do still do heavily television presence. But interestingly enough, the nonprofits, although some of them are doing these things, they're still sending out lots of generic form letters to students and high school students around the country and ignoring adult students to a large extent. So it's been a steady evolution from paper to online lead generation to social media, and now schools are getting better at blending those things in a much more fluid way to adapt to whatever's working for them on the back end.
And you're seeing, I think, especially with colleges and universities, you're seeing a lot of content driven. I mean, not just social,
Absolutely.
But amplifying that content within a social type feed.
Yeah, Kenneth, it's interesting. One of the things that I tell schools all the time is they are, unlike most other organizations, they should be primed to be experts in content marketing, because
Absolutely.
If you think about it, a school is nothing but a content generator. That's all they are. They
what better stories
education.
to tell?
Yeah, and education is nothing but content. And so if you can give a piece of that content away as a taste of what you provide in terms of education, then you should have a cheap and easy way to present your expertise, and then it's a matter of presenting a return on investment equation to the consumer.
Well, which is something you may remember with that you and I worked on in the past. I was doing a heavy content play for school groups, and that was early before, I don't know, there was an early adopter, but before the technology that allowed that amplification really took off to make it so worthwhile. And you see so many of them doing it so well today. And talk a little bit about some of the universities. I mean, the ones that have done well, you've got a lot of smart universities out there that are in the nonprofit space that are either state schools or nonprofits, like a Liberty, a Southern New Hampshire. A lot of these schools have very smart marketing departments. They
right.
really know how to go from not having state funds to push them in, but these are really complex departments that have helped schools to propel to have over 100,000 students.
Well, and the reason they've done so is because they've decided to have a true marketing mix.
Exactly.
And there are three types of marketing departments in higher education. There are passive marketers who basically are experts in advertising or branding, in that they send out the exact right set of direct mail, and when that doesn't work, they send out more, or they buy billboards, or have events. They have been stuck in sort of this cycle over time, and then don't understand why it doesn't work. The second type are lead wranglers, where they're simply trying to generate leads and do it as cost effectively or efficiently as possible, and then give those leads to reps who pound the phones, and they wrangle leads for a living. And then you have the successful organizations like a Southern New Hampshire or Grand Canyon or Liberty that have combined strong investment in offline marketing, i.e. television, you'll see their ads, with digital marketing that matches the tone and message of the offline marketing, and strong social media lead generation content marketing efforts that are underpin all of that. And so they really have done a good job of combining all the different aspects of the marketing mix into a compelling, consistent message, and then they have the admissions and response mechanisms on the back end. The only issue is over time, you start to say the same thing. And so, a Grand Canyon, a Liberty, and a Southern New Hampshire are all going to talk about adult students and their appeal for working adults or first generation in college, or that they have a ground campus. And you start to wonder what the differentiation is. But between now and that point, they're going to lead the charge,
Sure.
and they're going to succeed, and smaller schools like Merrillhurst and others that you've seen in the news are going to disappear.
And I always think it's amazing, even Arizona State, a public university seems to be run so well.
Oh, yeah.
When you think about the partnerships that they have, and the fact that they tout that they're the number one in the country in online degree programs.
Oh, yeah.
Number 5 for like best qualified candidates. I mean, they really know how to promote that as a business as much as your typical brick and mortar type education speak. So let's talk then a little bit about the challenges in performance marketing, specifically with lead gen with School State. There have been an immense number of schools close over the last 10 years, some of it because of government regulations. I know a lot of for-profits thought when Trump was coming into office, because he had a university, that everything was going to get rosy again, and it hasn't.
It's not.
Market pressures change, but let's talk a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the market pressures, the challenges that people see in lead gen today for universities, because it is a different type of mix.
It is, and I think what you're finding is over time it was a volume game, right? If we generate enough leads, it doesn't really matter what the conversion rate is from lead to a student, because the cost of the individual lead was so low that they didn't have to necessarily be efficient. And I call it the feed the chicks model. We generate enough activity for an admissions rep to make enough phone calls that over time we can have enough students to keep the doors open. And as conversion rates dropped, the cost per acquisition increased, and it simply was not sustainable. And I think the biggest problem and the biggest difficulty with lead gen marketing is too many schools misinterpret how lead gen works. And they look at lead gen as prospective students, when in reality, lead gen is really just names. And so they're measuring the ability to convert a name into a student as a definition of what is effective in terms of marketing. When the reality is, marketing's job is to create opportunities for sales. In the case of higher education, it's for admissions. Anything beyond that, we might call that an interview or a contact or a qualified contact. Anything beyond that is not the responsibility of marketing. Anything beyond that is responsibility of the sales or admissions department. So as we evaluate the effectiveness of marketing and we look at it as a cost per contact or cost per interview, then you quickly understand how inefficient poorly done lead generation is. And the schools that never figured that math out quickly found themselves upside down in terms of their return on marketing investment. Marketing became a massive percentage of their revenue, and they realized that because they were so dependent on lead generation as their biggest marketing vehicle, as opposed to establishing a brand or actually having a marketing mix, they simply could not afford it. And you saw schools, number one, drop their marketing spend dramatically, but then their mistake was not know how to repurpose dollars in other ways that provided effective results, because they did not build that groundwork. And Kenneth, better than most, the ability to sell based on your brand is not something you can turn on overnight. And so if you're a school with a very minimal brand proposition, and you based your success on volume alone, and that volume no longer is available or at least cost effective, then you have no brand to fall back on. And that's why, again, going back to the earlier examples, the Southern New Hampshire, Arizona State, Grand Canyon, and others, because they'd spent significant amount of time, effort, and money on building a brand via traditional media as well as content and social, et cetera. But you see their name in various places. They had that to fall back on when lead gen becomes less efficient.
Well, let's talk about, like, giving another example, the history of Grand Canyon University.
Mm-hmm.
Nonprofit, was about to fold, became
Yep.
for profit when
Yep.
people took over that knew how to market a university. It exploded in growth and went back after that to nonprofit. I mean, that is
Well, they're trying to. They're not
trying
approved
to,
yet.
not approved yet, but
Yeah.
they're trying to. And the fact that they've gotten
Right.
this close will be.
Mm-hmm.
It's really an interesting story. And I think I've worked with school groups for 10, 15 years now. And I remember even early on in the early days where professors in marketing, for example, were pulled into conversations as lead gen really became a more important issue. And the worst person, unfortunately, to talk to is your really, bright and smart marketing professor who doesn't have a background in lead gen. As smart as
Right.
they are on theory, much smarter than I'm going to ever be able to do well on any test, that's not the type of marketing that is helping universities grow. And to your point about brand position, it takes time, but schools need
Right.
more than time. They need enrollments in order to stay open and pay for those high marketing professor salaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen schools on the nonprofit side close recently because they had the opposite problem. They had a very niche brand and no lead generation, and also backed themselves in the corner in terms of their geographic reach or their programmatic reach, and as a result, weren't able to scale appropriately. You won't see a Grand Canyon type story in the future where school is almost about to close and then all of a sudden miraculously grows, because it's just not going to happen. And so Grand Canyon has gotten very smart in terms of promoting the fact that they are a ground campus, a traditional institution with an online arm. So you're going to a quote-unquote real school, which is essentially a dig at some of the other online programs. And they have an additional specific niche in that they're a Christian university, similar to Liberty. And so you think of Grand Canyon as really kind of a West Coast version of Liberty University with a growing athletic program and a little newer. Quite not quite as heavy hand on the Christian market side as Liberty is, but it's still a niche. And then Southern New Hampshire has created the same kind of niche as being the college for the new traditional student, the first-time college working adult military student that is looking for the opportunity to get a cheaper education with more options. So they have a lot of programs at a lower price, and those schools are leading the way.
Yeah, and smart that they you talk about athletics. They brought in Dan Marley to coach their team, so they knew how to attract a big local name.
Absolutely.
For Phoenix. So you talked about nonprofits closing, and it's a great point because there's so many nonprofits across the country that dot the landscape that have 1,200 students, 1,500 students, charge $20,000 to $40,000 a year, and they're struggling to stay open. And
sure.
So let's talk a little bit then about the differences in lead generation for nonprofit versus for-profit, and maybe some of the tactics that help each of those brands, those types of
Right.
each of those types of positions.
Well, it's interesting because from a nonprofit perspective, what I've said for years is, up until maybe 5-6 years ago, if you went to one of the typical online lead gen sites that are managed by several dozen companies that produce thousands of leads a week, what you find when you go there is predominantly for-profit brands. And what I've said for years was, if a nonprofit was smart, they would get all over these lead gen sites, because when you go to, and an analogy I use, and this is a horrible analogy, but stick with me. If you're an average looking person, but you go to a bar that's full of ugly people, you're Miss America. So if you're an average, brand anywhere in the country that's somewhat recognizable, maybe a small athletic program or some other name that people recognize, and you're on the same page as University of Phoenix or some other local for-profit institution that really no one's ever heard of, you're going to stand out. Well, they did not necessarily take advantage of that until very, very recently. So as a nonprofit, what you'll find, you still won't see them on a lot of quote-unquote typical lead gen sites, but the ones that are there are starting to get much better at really touting the fact that they have everything that the for-profits have in terms of program selection, and they're A, cheaper, B, have a more respected brand name, and C, have the amenities that some of the for-profits are unable to offer. Where they have the gap, and they're starting to get better at doing this, and they're really expressing this on their lead gen environments, is up until recently they haven't had a great track record of supporting the non-traditional student, whether that's lower income, military, or working adult. But they're getting much, much better at it. And so you're starting to see them, in some cases, catch up. Too many of them still don't want to play in that area because they think it's beneath them. But the ones that do, particularly at the graduate level, the graduate level is as fierce and Wild West as anything in higher education. They're starting to play in that lead gen field, and they're starting to use their strengths to stand out. So they can pay a little less as long as they're on the same page as one of the for-profits. They're going to still be very likely to get that lead because people are going to recognize the name, and they're going to seek that out, and they're going to skip the 2 or 3 other schools above them.
Makes perfect sense. So let's go back to the value of a degree then today, especially with a marketing degree. You've got one. And there's so many people who are going to have so many different opinions about whether or not you should have a degree or not. Some people are going to tie it to a job. Some people are going to tie it on, show that you've achieved a level, certification, or you've taught yourself the ability to think and progress. So talk about the value of a degree, specifically a marketing degree in the marketing space today.
Sure. So I'll use another analogy, and Kenneth, I apologize, I love analogies. So I read something recently that talked about athletes and how more and more coaches at the college level in particular are starting to put more value on high school athletes who have played more than one sport. And trust me, this has a point to it that relates to a marketing degree. And so rather than, only go after those quarterbacks who, from the age of 5 went to quarterback camps and had private quarterback tutors and did nothing but be quarterback for, 12 years, they're actually looking at those athletes that play baseball or basketball or others because they understand they're more well-rounded, they can see the field from different perspectives, and they ultimately are smarter individuals in a team environment. Well, in my opinion, the same is true when it comes to education and the marketing, quote-unquote, marketing degree. The marketing degree itself has, to be frank, limited value because a significant amount of what you're going to learn by doing. And you're going to obviously want to learn the fundamentals, the 4 Ps and all that good stuff. You're going to want to learn how to understand the customer and the psychology of the customer. But a lot of what you're going to want to learn is how social media works and some other aspects that are constantly changing or very fluid. You can learn them in college, but you don't necessarily have to go to college. But to go back to our sports analogy, the person who is more well-rounded, who has more experiences in terms of understanding history, psychology, sociology, all the different aspects of the world that will inform them to become better marketers. That, to me, is the value of a degree, and particularly a marketing degree, because a marketing degree, at the end of the day, your job is to figure out how to sell something to someone. It doesn't necessarily have to be for money. You could be selling a charity or whatever the case may be. But as a marketer, your job is to sell product A to person B. And the more you can understand the motivations, the context, and all the different aspects of that transaction or what goes into a successful transaction, the better. So you've got to understand history. You've got to understand finance. You've got to understand psychology. You've got to understand communications. All those things are very well delivered. I should say well, are available to be delivered. There's some debate over how well they're delivered, but are available to be delivered pretty much only in a college environment today. You can certainly learn on the street, but you're not going to get that breadth and wealth of information in a formalized way and be able to exhibit mastery in many places besides at least today, a college or a degree environment. And that's what I see as being the greatest value of getting a degree. I think a marketing degree or a degree in general is still a prerequisite when it comes to getting hired in most organizations. But having gone through the different aspects of understanding, again, history, psychology, communications, and so on and so forth, finance in particular, how numbers work and how to determine ROI and efficiency of marketing spend, college is where you're going to get that stuff. And, whether it's undergrad or graduate school, you don't necessarily have to have an undergrad in marketing. A grad degree in an area is absolutely fine, but if you're going to be a successful marketer, in my opinion, at 22 or 23, at least come out of the gate with some capabilities, you've got to understand more than just marketing, and then you've got to be really good at marketing.
So, Dale, how should the Legion experience, how it fits in the higher ed education ecosystem, how should that work from a school Legion buyer perspective, and how should it work from a consumer/student perspective?
Sure, great question, Kenneth. So I'll talk about it from a school perspective in terms of how we measure the success of any lead gen program. First of all programs at the end of the day within marketing should either be lead gen or branding. And you have to separate those two. There are branding opportunities that lift the boats, that create opportunities for lead gen that are hard to attribute, whether it's running TV ads, running radio ads that maybe don't produce direct response, but you can see the impact on traffic to your website or name recognition, et cetera. Everything else, in my opinion, should be lead gen in the sense of the return on investment should be measured. The ability to create lifetime value should be measured. And I think, and I mentioned this earlier, how it should work is that you should measure lead gen programs based primarily on their ability to create opportunities for your admissions team in the case of higher education. Call that interview, call that qualified contact, but I measure everything I do first and foremost on the number of interviews I produce and my cost per interview. Because, and I've said this a million times, I could generate a terrific lead if it goes to an admissions rep that's not doing a good job or has an off day, and it doesn't convert into a student. That doesn't mean it was a bad lead. Conversely, if I create a horrible lead and it goes to an admissions rep who's having the day of their lives and they're able to turn that around and save it, it doesn't mean it was a good lead. So in my opinion, the measurement is focused primarily on what did I spend to create a name that became a suspect, that became a prospect, and ultimately became an interview or a qualified contact so that market or admissions could take over and run it. So that's how it should work. And you'll find once you start measuring things from that perspective, you tend to make very different decisions on what lead gen opportunities you pursue. So that's on the school side. On the consumer side, how it should work is consumers should have transparency in terms of how their information is used. And I'll use this analogy, you've heard it probably many times with Facebook. If you're not paying the bill, then you're the product. Well, a lot of folks who are going to these search sites and looking at information on colleges and filling out a form, and I've done a couple of different studies on this and presented it at conventions and seminars and done blog posts where you can submit a form and within a week get 65 phone calls. In the next hour, the first hour, you'll get 20 phone calls. That is not an effective or efficient means of engaging the customer. And so the fundamental question you have to ask yourself is, God forbid we actually talk to people in the way they want us to talk to them. So when you fill out a form from a consumer, what you should be asked is, what's your name, what's your interest, what program are you interested in, how would you like to be communicated with, and what information would you like to have? By doing that, instead of forcing everyone down this same funnel of give us your name so we can call you, and call you, and call you, and call you, that does no one any good. And so from a consumer perspective, that's what's led to a lot of frustration. It's led to a lot of bad decisions on the part of consumers in terms of pursuing their education. I think there's a fundamental line, direct line between the lead gen experience from a consumer perspective and the lack of graduation and higher debt rates with no degree on the back end. Now, people may laugh, but if you go through a bad experience up front, make a bad decision because of it, and you're spending $60,000 to go to school, that's a very expensive bad decision, and it's affecting all of us in the form of student debt and the coming student debt bubble.
Yeah, you're talking about people that are left with trying to make a major purchase, and then basically having to pay for, a Lexus every year.
Absolutely.
Pay for
and
a new
you
car.
Can't discharge it in bankruptcy.
There's no lease buyback on that. So, well, I always feel like I've gotten smarter just by talking to you. I would say you give a master's level class on higher ed. I'd at least like to get some sort of certificate from somewhere for completing this podcast. But tell us where people could find out more about ClearDegree.
Absolutely. It's very simple. ClearDegree.com, spelled just like it sounds. Check it out. And you can also follow us on social media, Facebook/ClearDegree, or Twitter is @ClearDegree. And we'd love to get anyone's feedback on the service. And if you have a need for getting a degree and finishing one or getting the next degree for your life, check us out. We have a money-back guarantee, and we'd love to work with you.
Thank you so much for being on A Shark's Perspective, Dale.
Hey, thank you, Ken. It's always a pleasure.
So there was my conversation with Dale Leatherwood, the co-founder of ClearDegree, and let's take a look at 3 key learnings from my conversation with him. First, consumers, especially students, should have transparency in how their information is being used for marketing purposes. Second, when looking at colleges and universities experiencing strong success in marketing, the successful organization has a combined strong investment in offline marketing, like TV, with digital marketing that matches the tone and message of the offline marketing, and strong social media, lead generation, and content marketing efforts. Those combine all the different aspects of the marketing mix into a compelling, consistent messages for the admissions department to follow. Third, institutions of higher ed have some of the best opportunities to turn a content strategy into effective, cheap, and easy lead generation techniques, oftentimes as effective, if not more, than paid search. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this show regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. Join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.